When I bought my home in Pine Ridge Estates, I thought I'd found my sanctuary. I remember the first time I pulled into the cul-de-sac, a quiet loop of townhomes tucked between a stand of old oaks and a serene little pond. Birds chirped, kids played, and the lawns were manicured to the inch. It was one of those neighborhoods where people waved as you drove by. I thought I'd found peace. I thought I'd found acceptance. What I didn't see that day was the storm brewing just beneath the perfect grass and white fences. I didn't know that behind the smiles were neighbors who measured worth by conformity and control. And I certainly didn't know that my wheelchair-accessible van, my lifeline, would be the trigger for war. I'm Naomi Taylor, 38, a paraplegic and former firefighter. I got injured in a warehouse collapse responding to a 4-alarm blaze. The roof gave out. I went down with it. I don't like sympathy, and I sure as hell don't want your pity. I work remotely as a fire safety consultant, and I live my life with grit and stubborn pride. That van, it's not just transportation. It's freedom. It's how I get to my doctor's appointments, to the store, to my sister's house. It has a side ramp, extra height hand controls, and enough space for my service dog, Baxter, to hop in the back. The first week I moved in, I parked it in my driveway like any normal vehicle. That's when the notes started showing up. The first was printed in curling cursive on pale pink stationery, tucked under my wiper blade. Welcome to Pine Ridge Estates. Just a friendly reminder that vehicles of commercial appearance or medical equipment transport must be stored out of public view to maintain neighborhood aesthetics. Please park in your garage or seek HOA guidance. Thank you. It was unsigned, but I didn't need a signature to know where it came from. The HOA president, Karen Delaney, introduced herself the day I moved in. Blonde bob, tight smile, clipboard in hand. She wore a pastel sweater set even though it was 87 degrees. Her gaze had flicked over my van like it was a trash dumpster with wheels. I politely explained that the van didn't fit in my garage because of its height and modifications. I'd already looked into that before buying the place. HOA regulations are clear on this, I added, trying to sound calm. You can't restrict someone with a disability from using accessible transportation, and the van is registered as a personal vehicle, not commercial. She tilted her head like she was absorbing that information, but her smile thinned. Oh, we're all about inclusivity here. We just want to preserve the look of the neighborhood. It's nothing personal. It was always nothing personal. 3 weeks later, I came out one morning, and my van was gone. At first, I thought it had been stolen. I felt that hot wave of panic hit, nausea, rage, confusion. I fumbled for my phone, calling the police. But before I could finish dialing, my neighbor across the street, Mr. Hernandez, jogged over. I saw them tow it early this morning, he said, his eyes wide. It looked official, had Pine Ridge security on the truck. I thought you knew. I didn't. I had no notice, no warning, nothing posted. My van was towed without my knowledge or consent. I called the HOA emergency line, and who answered but Karen herself, as chipper as a squirrel in spring. Oh, Naomi, yes, we had to act due to multiple complaints. The van is in clear violation of our aesthetic code, section 14B, no visibly modified vehicles or utility-type transports allowed in driveways. You towed my only vehicle without telling me, I snapped. That's illegal. You didn't even give me a notice. We posted warnings, she replied coolly. You left a passive-aggressive note that wasn't even signed. That's not legal notice. Karen sighed. You'll need to arrange pickup with the impound lot. There's a daily fee, of course. We can't make exceptions for everyone. It's about fairness. Fairness. I hung up on her before I started screaming. It took me 2 days to get my van back. I had to arrange transportation from a friend, then shell out over $400 in impound fees. The van's side mirror had been cracked and the rear ramp mount had fresh scuff marks, but I was lucky it wasn't worse. Towing modified vehicles improperly can damage lifts, electrical systems, or the suspension. They hadn't used a flatbed, they'd just latched it up like it was a junker from the side of the road. I filed a police report. I contacted the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. I even emailed a local disability rights lawyer, though I hadn't heard back yet. But something inside me shifted that day. Before, I just wanted to live quietly. I wanted to be left alone. But now I wanted the world to see what Karen and her board were really about. It didn't stop with the van. A week later, I got a compliance violation in the mail for unauthorized outdoor modifications. The modification, a short ramp I'd placed over the 2 steps to my front door, painted white to match the trim, professionally installed, but apparently it wasn't approved by the architectural committee. Then came the complaints about Baxter barking during the day. Baxter, who literally has service dog credentials and barely barks unless someone is at the door. Then came an accusation that I was running a business from home without a permit, my consulting work. Each week it was something new, a fresh paper cut of bureaucratic harassment. What Karen didn't know was that while she was documenting me, I was documenting her. I bought security cameras, I recorded our conversations, I printed out every piece of mail and filed every voicemail. I found other residents, quiet ones who had stories of their own. Elderly folks fined for their gardens. Single moms hit with fees for toy clutter in the yard. One veteran, Mr. Rankin, who'd been threatened with a lien because he put up a small American flag without permission. There was a pattern, and it wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. And I had just started to fight. 2 days after I got my van back from the impound, I sat across from an attorney in a downtown office that smelled like lemon oil and justice. Her name was Reena Kapoor, civil rights specialist. Smart, razor-sharp eyes and a voice like velvet over steel. She didn't blink when I told her what happened. She just asked questions, listened. "Let me guess," she said, flipping through the stack of documents I'd brought. "They never issued any formal citations before towing your vehicle. No hearing, no vote, no enforcement meeting." "Nope. And this is a mobility device, correct? You're not hauling oxygen tanks or picking people up. It's your private accessible vehicle." "Exactly." She smiled, but it wasn't the warm kind. They've walked themselves right into a lawsuit. What I hadn't known, what Reena made clear, was that federal law, particularly under the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, gives homeowners with disabilities certain unshakable rights. Denying reasonable accommodation is illegal. Retaliating for requesting those accommodations is also illegal. "I want to sue them," I said without hesitation. Reena leaned back, her hands folded. "We're going to do more than that. We're going to set a precedent." What followed wasn't easy or fast. Over the next month, I became the most inconvenient resident Pine Ridge Estates had ever seen. It started with filing a formal complaint through HUD's Fair Housing Office. Reena helped me prepare the paperwork, complete with evidence of the violations, photos of the van, timestamps, recordings, and the whole paper trail. She advised me to stop arguing with the HOA and let her handle the communication. But I didn't stay quiet. I started attending HOA meetings. The first one I showed up to, people acted like I'd walked in with a bomb strapped to my wheelchair. Karen froze mid-sentence when she saw me roll into the rec center's meeting room, a friend at my side, holding a GoPro. "Are you recording this?" Karen asked, her voice tight. "Yes," I replied calmly. "Under state law, public HOA meetings can be recorded by members. Don't worry, I brought snacks too." They tried to hurry the meeting along, but I asked questions. Polite, firm, pointed. Why were rules being enforced selectively? Why was the HOA denying a disabled resident their civil rights? Why were no board minutes or finances made available on request? Karen stumbled. The treasurer, a grizzled man named Doug who looked like he'd rather be ice fishing, kept glancing at her like she was supposed to save him. A few residents clapped when I finished speaking. 2 days later, someone egged my front door. I didn't report it, I just cleaned it up, replaced my security cameras with upgraded ones, and kept going. Because now I wasn't alone. After that first meeting, more people reached out, quiet knocks on my door, notes slipped into my mailbox, emails, texts. A retired schoolteacher named Ruth had been fined $250 for painting her shutters unapproved beige. A young couple had been warned about their disruptive holiday display, a single string of lights during Diwali. A man with PTSD had been hassled about a small wind chime on his porch that he said helped him sleep. Pine Ridge didn't have a Karen problem, it had a systemic problem. I started collecting these stories, documenting them. With consent, I recorded testimony. I created a private Facebook group, Pine Ridge Against Abuse of Power, and within days it had over 30 members, people who had never spoken up now finding each other, sharing, getting angry. That's when the real retaliation began. I got a letter from the HOA's attorney, one Karen had apparently pulled from a dusty file of old buddies. It accused me of defamation, threatened a cease and desist, and warned of potential, legal consequences for spreading misinformation. Reena laughed out loud when she read it. "They're bluffing," she said, "and they're panicking, good, let them." But the harassment escalated. Anonymous complaints were filed against me for public disturbances. Baxter, my service dog, was targeted again. Someone even left a pile of poisoned meat on my front lawn. Thank God he was trained not to touch anything without my command. The police started taking notice, not just because I was calling, but because the pattern was becoming visible. I filed formal reports, demanded copies of HOA meeting records, and filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the city for any correspondence between the board and code enforcement. What I found, emails, lots of them, from Karen to a local towing company, Pine Ridge Security, requesting special pickups for certain residents, none of them documented in HOA meeting notes, none approved by board vote, all retaliatory. Rena compiled everything. Then one morning, just before dawn, there was a knock on my door. Not police. Not a neighbor's. It was a reporter. Janelle Ortiz from Channel 4 News. She'd heard about what happened through a disability rights advocate I'd met online. She wanted to do a segment. Wheelchair user harassed by HOA, her producer had pitched it. I agreed on one condition. We make it about more than just me, I said. This isn't one story, it's dozens. The piece aired 3 days later during the 6 o'clock broadcast. It showed my van, the HOA letters, excerpts of the towing footage, interviews with Ruth, Mr. Rankin, and even the young couple with the Diwali lights. Karen was featured too, or rather she was filmed speed-walking away from the camera crew in her tennis whites, shouting no comment, as her poodle tried to bite a cameraman. The fallout was immediate. The HOA's voicemail inbox filled up, emails leaked. Local disability advocates began organizing a protest outside the next HOA meeting. HUD's investigation went into high gear. And I got a letter, hand-delivered, not from Karen. From the Department of Justice. They were joining the case. The Department of Justice doesn't send letters lightly. Mine arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked in a thick manila envelope with official seals and long paragraphs. I read it twice, then again, my hands trembling not from fear, but from something deeper, validation. The kind that you only understand after being gaslit, stonewalled, and targeted for too long. Rena called me 20 minutes later. They're filing a federal civil rights suit, she said. You're the lead complainant. This just became national. It wasn't just about a van anymore. It was about systemic abuse, retaliation against protected classes, and a governing body that had grown too comfortable with its own unchecked power. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division had reviewed the evidence and determined there was merit for federal litigation. They named the Pine Ridge HOA, Karen Delaney personally, and the towing company as defendants. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting 2 days later, and this time it wasn't in the community center. It was in the back room of a local church, tucked behind stained glass and dusty hymnals, away from public cameras. But I showed up anyway. With a recorder in my lap and Rena sitting right beside me in a tailored suit, and heels sharp enough to gut fish. Karen looked like she hadn't slept. Her usual pastel pastiche was replaced by a wrinkled gray blouse, and her smile, what remained of it, was frozen in panic. I'd like to address the recent news story and legal misunderstandings, she began, blinking too fast. There's been a lot of misinformation circulating about our community guidelines. I raised my hand. She ignored it. Someone in the back coughed loud, intentional, then a voice said, "Let her speak." Karen didn't have a choice. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I just read from the ADA's title III guidelines, then cited the Fair Housing Amendments Act. I read lines that made people shift uncomfortably in their chairs, lines about what it means to deny someone the use of their home due to disability-related accommodations, about how weaponizing community rules becomes discrimination when it's enforced selectively. Every violation issued against me was retaliation, I said, my voice steady. And if you think this lawsuit will stop with me, you're wrong, because I'm not the only one you've targeted. The room didn't erupt, but it cracked. Mr. Rankin stood, then Ruth, then the couple who'd been silenced for their culture. One by one, they took turns speaking slowly, cautiously, like people learning they had a right to raise their voices. Karen looked like she wanted the floor to open and swallow her whole. Then came something unexpected. Doug, the grizzled treasurer who had once backed every one of Karen's actions, cleared his throat and said, "I move to suspend President Delaney pending legal review." The room went silent. "Seconded," said someone behind me. It didn't pass, not then, but the tremor was felt. The next morning my mailbox was ripped open and left hanging by one hinge. My trash can knocked over, contents scattered across the sidewalk. Petty, small. But I was done playing small. Rena filed an injunction for immediate protection. We were granted a temporary restraining order against Karen and 2 board members from contacting or approaching me. The DOJ added a supplemental complaint for harassment. Meanwhile, the story kept spreading. Other media outlets picked it up. A disability rights podcast interviewed me. A legal blog started tracking the case. Donations poured in for our growing community legal fund. Then something wild happened. I got a call from a former HOA board member, a woman named Cynthia, who had served on the board 5 years prior and had resigned abruptly. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said, voice shaking. "Karen manipulated everything. She called secret meetings, rewrote minutes, even voided votes when people disagreed with her. She used HOA funds for personal expenses. I couldn't prove it, but I knew." Cynthia still had old emails, screenshots, PDFs. She forwarded everything to Rena. It was a smoking gun. Financial irregularities, backdated fines, proof of a private HOA task force Karen created to monitor undesirable residents, a list that included me, the Hernandezes, whose teen son uses a wheelchair, and a woman undergoing chemo who had once requested an exemption to keep her medical transport visible. It got worse. Rena brought in a forensic accountant, who found that over $17,000 in HOA dues had been spent over the last 2 years with no accountability. Community enhancements, the records said. In reality, personal landscaping at Karen's house, spa services labeled as board retreats, and a suspicious invoice from the towing company, almost $3,000 in contracted enforcement. The towing company, it turned out, was run by Karen's cousin, registered under a shell LLC. The DOJ updated the complaint again. Fraud, retaliation, discrimination. The walls were closing in. Meanwhile, something strange happened in the neighborhood. People started talking again, outside, in groups. Someone offered to repaint my broken mailbox. A teen I didn't know knocked on my door and said he was doing a school project on disability awareness and could he interview me. Ruth started a community bulletin board on the local app Nextdoor. Mr. Rankin organized a flag-raising ceremony for Memorial Day and invited the entire neighborhood. Even Baxter seemed to feel the shift. He was calmer, ears perked, tail up. Then, as if sensing she was losing ground, Karen made one last move. A letter was circulated, an apology of sorts, full of regrets and misunderstandings, and thinly veiled self-praise about preserving the community. It ended with a request for forgiveness and a suggestion that residents avoid divisive legal entanglements. It was mailed to every house but mine. Didn't matter, the damage was done. 2 days later, a vote was held. Karen Delaney was removed as HOA president by a majority vote of the residents. The vote wasn't close. A new interim board was appointed, 5 members, all people I'd come to know through this fight. One of them was Ruth. Another was a working mom named Lena whose toddler used a walker. For the first time, the board looked like the community it claimed to represent. But the legal battle wasn't over. Federal court was next. And I was ready. The federal courtroom wasn't what I expected. It didn't feel grand or theatrical like it does in the movies. It felt sterile, fluorescent. The air was cold and dry. Still, when I rolled in beside Rena and took my place behind the plaintiff's table, I felt like I was walking into battle wearing armor no one could see. Karen sat across the room, 2 seats away from her cousin, the towing company owner, whose name I now knew was Dennis Barrow. Their attorney looked like he regretted taking the case the moment the DOJ got involved. He shuffled papers, whispered rapidly, and tried to look calm while Karen stared at me with a look I recognized instantly, contempt barely veiled by panic. It was a bench trial, no jury, just a federal judge with decades of experience and the quiet, simmering stare of someone who's heard every excuse in the book. The Department of Justice led the charge. The lead attorney was a sharp-tongued, cool-headed woman named Alina Briggs who moved like she'd been waiting for this moment for years. She didn't just outline the discrimination, she painted it. She brought up my van first. Photos, records, witness statements, the HOA's own documents or lack thereof, the fact that no towing notice was filed officially, no ticket, no documentation of any vote approving the action, and the kicker Dennis Barrow's own billing invoice which listed expedited removal, mobility van under the line item. The courtroom got very quiet. Rena took over for our witnesses. One by one, they testified. Mr. Rankin, in his full military regalia, recounted how he'd been warned about improper displays when he put a small veteran's plaque near his porch. Ruth told the court how she was fined for beige shutters, while the board president had lavender ones. Lena, who broke down crying, shared how her toddler's walker was once deemed a trip hazard by a board member when left near her stoop. Then came Cynthia. She testified with her voice trembling but firm. She exposed Karen's secret task force, the selective enforcement, and the fraudulent invoices. She provided a paper trail of HOA funds that had paid for Karen's backyard gazebo, one never approved in any budget meeting. And then it was my turn. I told my story calmly, every detail, every escalation, every humiliation. I told them how it felt to watch my only means of transportation, my independence, hauled away like garbage in the early morning light. I spoke about Baxter nearly dying from that poisoned bait. I described the fear, the rage, the quiet ache of being reminded that to some people I would always be a nuisance. I didn't cry. But when I finished, Rena gently reached under the table and squeezed my hand. The defense tried to reframe everything as standard enforcement. Their lawyer called me overly sensitive and tried to argue that the HOA's goal was neighborhood harmony. But it didn't land. Judge Heitwer, an older man with piercing gray eyes, interrupted. Are you suggesting that towing a mobility device, without notice or due process, in a neighborhood with multiple elderly and disabled residents promotes harmony? Their lawyer stuttered. Karen folded her arms. And Dennis, sweaty, red-faced Dennis, tried to claim he didn't know the van was modified for a wheelchair. Aliner pulled out a photo from his towing invoice, which clearly showed the blue and white disabled veteran plate. Do you tow all cars with accessibility plates as a matter of policy? She asked. Silence. In the days that followed, we heard closing statements. Rena outlined every violation, citing case law like a blade. The DOJ followed with a request for not only injunctive relief but financial damages and federal oversight of the HOA's governance structure. The court adjourned for deliberation. While we waited, the community surged. The new interim board held an emergency town hall, and over 100 residents came. They voted on a new transparency policy, eliminated vague enforcement codes, and formed a review committee with input from residents, including me. HOA fines were frozen pending external audit. The community newsletter, once a passive-aggressive Karen monologue, was now being drafted collaboratively by residents. Then 5 weeks after the trial ended, the verdict came down. The federal court found Pine Ridge HOA in violation of the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Karen Delaney and Dennis Barrow were named directly liable for willful retaliation and discriminatory enforcement. They were ordered to pay damages, not just to me, but to 7 other residents who had joined the case after the trial began. The HOA was placed under federal oversight for a minimum of 3 years, with quarterly compliance reports due to the DOJ. Karen was barred from holding any leadership position in an HOA or neighborhood governance board for 5 years. Dennis lost his towing license. I was awarded financial compensation, enough to replace my van if needed, enough to reinforce my home for better accessibility, enough to breathe. But that wasn't the real victory. The real win was what came next. The neighborhood changed. People stopped whispering, they started building. Ramps were installed in common areas. Meetings began with open forums for all residents, not just the board. A mobility-accessible park was approved for construction on the empty lot near the pond, the same spot Karen once wanted to fence off as unsightly. Residents volunteered to help install raised beds for community gardening, with wheelchair-friendly paths and benches. Lena joined the new board. Ruth ran a voter education workshop. Mr. Rankin launched a weekly flag-raising event where veterans from the neighborhood could speak and share their stories. And me. I didn't move away. I stayed. I painted my ramp bold red. I had a mural commissioned on the side of my garage, a phoenix rising from coiled vines of ivy, flames behind it in golden swirls. My new van, sleek silver with custom modifications, sat proudly in my driveway. Unhidden, unapologetic. For the first time, Pine Ridge Estates felt like a community I belonged to, not because I was allowed to, but because I fought to. And I wasn't done. 6 months after the verdict, I found myself standing in front of a microphone in the city council chambers. The room was packed. Residents, reporters, local politicians, disability rights advocates, and even students from a nearby university who'd come to hear about the Pine Ridge case. My story had become more than neighborhood drama. It had become a legal landmark. The city had asked me to speak during their annual Accessibility and Housing Equity Forum. I didn't wear a blazer or heels. I wore my station shirt from my old firehouse, Station 18, the one I nearly died in service of, and jeans that still had grease smudges from tuning up my van that morning. I didn't prepare a speech. I spoke from the same place I'd spoken that first night in the HOA meeting, when I'd walked into a room full of people who thought I'd stay quiet. I didn't want to be an activist, I told them. I just wanted to be able to get groceries, go to my doctor, live in my own home without fear. That shouldn't be revolutionary, but for people like me, disabled, working class, stubborn as hell, it sometimes still is. They gave me a standing ovation. Afterward, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said her teenage son had muscular dystrophy and had been denied reasonable accommodations by their condo board in a neighboring county. She thought they were alone. Then she read about my case. "We're not alone," she whispered. "You showed us that." That was when I knew this wasn't just about Pine Ridge anymore. I launched a nonprofit that spring, Access Unbound. Our mission, to educate residents about their rights, challenge discriminatory HOA practices, and support homeowners with disabilities who felt powerless against the weaponization of aesthetic codes. We partnered with law schools to provide free legal clinics. We gave out grants for home modifications. We trained board members across the state on inclusive governance. And we helped people stay in their homes. Back at Pine Ridge, things kept moving forward. The Federal Oversight Board helped establish a formal grievance system, and for the first time in the HOA's history, residents began to trust it. The new board even held a memorial ceremony for residents who had passed, those who'd suffered quietly under the old regime. Cynthia came out of retirement to serve on the Financial Oversight Committee. She and Ruth became close friends, hosting coffee chats and organizing block parties that everyone was invited to, whether they had beige shutters or rainbow wind chimes. Dennis Barrow vanished from public view after his license was revoked. Rumor had it he moved downstate, tried to reopen under a different business name. Didn't last long. As for Karen Delaney, she refused to apologize, even after the verdict, even after the fines, even after the media storm. She gave a single bitter interview to a local magazine, claiming she was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign by radicalized activists. It didn't gain traction. Last I heard, she'd put her house up for sale. The community she tried to control no longer wanted her. Her power, once absolute, had evaporated under the weight of exposure. Her reign of silence and fear was over. But the wounds she left behind, they'd taken root and grown something better, stronger. We didn't rebuild Pine Ridge into what it used to be. We remade it into something new. One afternoon, I came home to find chalk drawings on my driveway. Hearts, suns, dogs, and what looked like a very enthusiastic attempt at drawing my van. Two neighbor kids, Lena's daughter and Ruth's grandson, had left a note taped to my ramp. "You're our heroes." I sat there in my chair holding that note, feeling the wind come off the pond and push the trees into a soft rustle. Baxter sat beside me, tail thumping. He was older now, slower but loyal as ever. A woman I barely knew walked by with her baby in a sling and gave me a wave. "Love the mural," she said. "It gives the whole neighborhood life." "Thanks," I replied, smiling. That was the idea. That night I hosted a potluck on my lawn. The table was filled with dishes from every corner of the world. Dosas, mac and cheese, dumplings, empanadas, cornbread, hummus, collard greens. No one asked for permission. No one handed out citations. There were no whispers about what someone's house looked like or who had too many chairs on their porch. There were just people. Talking. Laughing. Living. We didn't win because we followed the rules. We won because we exposed the ones who weaponized them. We won because we stopped apologizing for existing. And we're just getting started.